Great. Uh, Thank you ever so much. So I am going to start my conversation about this topic by giving you some background as to my experiences and encounters with the law. So I grew up in an area which faced relative socioeconomic deprivation. It was an area where progression to university was low, where the rates of relative poverty by the standard of the UK were high, and where true educational flourishing was few and far between due to difficulties in student behavior and classroom resourcing. As a result, it shouldn't be overly surprising that a number of individuals ended up indulging themselves in petty crime. And what struck me so vividly growing up was how young that would be. I recall a period, I can't have been much older than 10 in my primary school days, where the police had to come to the school and take someone into custody. And the reason why is because it turned out that a 10-year-old had been a drug mule for his older brother and had actually been found with possession of cannabis on school premises. So I always had a conflicting attitude towards the police and the justice system more broadly. To some extent, I believed it was a genuine means through which people were to be kept safe and individuals were allowed their freedoms. On the other hand, it seemed to almost deliberately target those who are from the lowest backgrounds. And so I wanted to learn more about that. I got very into politics as a result. And by my own admissions, at least at that time, as a 16, 17-year-old, were pretty conservative about my politics as well. And once I left university, I decided that I wanted to, as part of my civic duty, put some time towards serving within the court system. Now, remember, I had little to no way of legal qualifications. And so what I opted to do instead was to become a volunteer magistrate, an individual who sits on some of the lowest level of crimes, though in recent years, the sentencing powers of magistrates have increased enormously. And some of the things that I would remark about the justice system, but particularly the voluntary justice system within the UK, is how old it is. Though people don't necessarily expect this, women are overrepresented within the voluntary judiciary. Up to 60% of all magistrates are women. Ethnic minorities are relatively well represented, though still underrepresented as a proportion of the total population. The thing that I remarked and the thing that really surprised me was that there was nobody in all of the courtrooms that day who was under the age of 50. The British judiciary is old and stale, and it shows. The reason why it shows is their attitudes towards things which actually, for much of the rest of us, have normalized. If I was to have an estimate, I would say 80% of criminal sentences are handed out for petty drug offences, possession of cannabis for personal consumption, and the like. And it was telling that the British system has continued to pursue a policy in which drugs have remained illegal. Let me be clear, I am someone who, up until my work in the judiciary, was very much against the idea that drugs should be accessible to the population more broadly. I believe that they represented a moral wrong within society, and I believe that they constituted a real healthcare risk. But it's very difficult to ignore the realities that I was confronted with. 80 to 90% of the people hauled before the court were young Black men whose sole crime was to carry a recreational quantity of cannabis, and the result of which would lead to them having criminal records and continued exposure to the more negative aspects of the justice system. I would see people in jail on no greater a charge than the fact that they had taken out 2 blunts of cannabis instead of 1. And I really want to emphasize on this racialized nature of these acts. The evidence broadly suggests that consumption of recreational substances is culturally defined, but the rates of consumption across all drugs is relatively stable. Indeed, more traditionally middle-class drugs, often more harmful drugs, such as cocaine, will tend to be more often consumed by a white, young, upwardly mobile or already quite affluent clientele who want to attach a certain level of cool factor to themselves. Yet, not once have I seen someone brought before the court on possession of cocaine. It suggests to me that something is really going wrong in the way in which we police both drugs and broader society in Britain. And it seems that the research from the past few decades, coming from Parliament itself, has chosen to agree with me. In the aftermath of the murder of Stephen Lawrence, a young, innocent Black man, at the hands of the police force, the Macpherson inquiry found that the British police was in large chunks institutionally racist. Think about that for a moment. An institution primarily tasked with ensuring that justice is enacted up and down the country seems more interested in the justice of one ethnic group over the justice of other ethnic groups. It seemed unfathomable to me. Until I was 16 or 17 years old, I had no real conception of what it meant to be an ethnic minority. I genuinely did not consider myself anything other than British. But serving in this justice system showed me that there was and remains a great deal of inequality. This inequality, unfortunately, has been made worse by continual cuts that the most recent Conservative government, though describing it as most recent, given it's been in power in one form or the other for a decade, seems strange. But it seems that cuts to legal aid have really harmed those from disadvantaged backgrounds getting a real fair hearing at trial. And those lack of resources is not just when it comes to getting a solicitor or to getting a barrister. The legal system in Britain is completely overwhelmed. It is no accident that individuals who are fundamentally not trained in the letter of the law are now able to pass sentences of 12 months. Imagine you take a whole year of someone's life on the basis of a decision that was made, albeit assisted, but made by someone with no legal training. It's quite a terrifying thought to hold, but that's the reality of justice in Britain. Now, what I want to come to you all with is it's clear that the justice system in the UK is in dire need of pretty wide-scale reforms, especially given that we are currently dealing with a 12-month backlog of cases that were basically unseeable as a result of COVID-19. And my proposals are threefold. Number one, it is now time to get rid of the archaic, backward, and unnecessary policies of drug restriction. This is not me calling for the legalization of drugs, but rather it should not be a reason that police will stop you in the streets and conduct a search. We may even choose to pursue a path of legalization for those drugs which have been proven time and time again to be safe when consumed in reasonable environments. Cannabis, LSD, and other forms of naturally occurring psychedelics have all been proven to have a lower harm factor than alcohol. The only thing which prevents them from being treated in the same way is that the thousands of years of history behind their consumption was erased, first by the Catholic Church, and then by Western civilizations that sought to portray the consumption habits of other cultures as lazy, unsophisticated, and backward. And I think it's time that we really recognize the long and storied history of safe consumption of these drugs, not because I would want to do them, but because it would allow you to remove 80% of pre-existing low-level cases overnight. Number two, we need to fundamentally look at whether prison is working for a number of these cases. If you look at Britain, if you look at the United States, they have some of the worst reoffending rates of anywhere in the world. And it's not for a lack of resources. The United States spends more on its justice system than any other nation on the planet, both in raw total and as a percentage of its total GDP. The result is 68% of those who go to prison, who are incarcerated for some period of time, will go on to reoffend within 2 years of getting out. Much a similar trend can be seen in Britain. And the reason why that happens is because prisons in Britain are designed to dehumanize. When the European Union quite rightly insisted that prisoners were still citizens of their country and still were entitled to the right to vote, David Cameron essentially went to war. He decided that he was not going to pursue the spirit of the law, and as a result, it is only those who are serving a sentence of less than 5 years who are entitled to vote in Britain, full stop. And with Britain leaving the European Union, I wouldn't be overly surprised whether even that forward-thinking measure was entirely reversed. We need to understand prisons not as a place of punishment, but as a place of meaningful, thoughtful rehabilitation. And I think the model that we see in many countries across Europe has proven to be a very good one. The third and final thing that I think needs to take place, perhaps the most radical of them all, is within a British context to see the deconstruction and the reconstruction of the policing system from top to bottom. It is clear, at least in my mind and in the mind of many other ethnic minorities within Britain, that the police system has ingrained within it an almost Victorian mindset, mired in inflexibility and prejudices which simply never reflected the world in which we live, and especially not the world in which we live now. By redefining what it means to be a police officer, by redefining the role as one primarily of social care, instead of as one which perpetrated violence, even if it is violence targeted to protect others, I think that is the direction in which we really want to go. Now, fundamentally, the thing that I want to end with is, do I believe this is going to happen? And the answer is unfortunately not. Britain has proven itself time and time again to be an increasingly conservative country, with a small c and large c connotations to that. It seems to me that much of the humanity and humility has been sapped from British policy making. The desire is efficiency. The desire is to maximize and minimize without understanding to what end those maximizations or minimizations are taking place. And I think it's a really, really regretful thing to see Britain diverging so much from the rest of the world on this issue. I hope that you leave with an understanding that the justice system in many countries reflects what it looks like in Britain, though the extent is different. And I know it's very common for all aspects of life to call for more money. But for me, I believe that something which is at the very bedrock of how we construct ourselves as a society is that both the prince and the pauper will have the same representation in the eyes of the law. That is not happening in the UK. Substantial change needs to take place in the UK for that to happen. Thank you very much.